Jim's a bit of juice. Oh.
Sorry.
Pardon me, sorry.
There we go.
Sorry.
This is our moderator. Timothy Faust is the author of Health Justice Now, also for sale down by the register. His writing has appeared in Splinter, Jacobin, and Vice, among others. His work as a data scientist in the healthcare industry and a wrestling promoter.
That's right.
But before which he enrolled people in ACA programs in Florida, Georgia, and Texas, where he saw both the shortcomings of the ACA and the consequences of the Medicaid gap firsthand. Since 2017, he's been driving around the United States in his 2002 Honda CR-V, talking to people about health inequality in their neighborhoods. He lives in Brooklyn.
Thank you. You don't need to cheer for me. This is Nathan's night and Nathan's book. I'm sure many of you are aware. If not, I'm sorry to break it to you like this. There's a bit of a crisis happening in the UK right now. Elections look pretty rotten. If for some reason you're looking at your phone, which is very rude during this event, and things good happen, please let us know. That'd be fantastic. But I was thinking about that on my bike ride over here, right? Why are we losing? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why will the NHS be privatized? Why will the UK experience deductibles? Why will sick mothers and sick kids and sick parents and sick friends have to go out of pocket to pay for healthcare that should be there and should be guaranteed a right? But socialism isn't about winning all the time. If it was, we wouldn't need this book. Socialism is about losing a lot and getting back up and doing the damn thing all over again, right? We've been fighting this fight for, this is not a new fight. The fight for a better world for all people has been happening for centuries upon centuries. And things suck a lot of the time, but you get back up, dust yourself off, and go win the thing you can win. And upon that victory, build more. Socialist is an active verb, even though it's a noun. It's an active way of being, not an identity, not a brand, not an adjective you use on your Tinder profile. It is a thing you do to improve the world around you. Which is why this book, here's the segue, why you should be a socialist is, I think, meaningful and important, right? It articulates that vision of a better world and then frames it in a sense of what we do want and how we get there and the things that are important to us and refutations of the arguments against it. So it is my pleasure to introduce the editor of Current Affairs magazine, a contributor columnist at the columnist at the Guardian, friend to you, me, and the universe, a man who can write more words in one night than I can write an entire week, the author of a big stack of children's books and also a big stack of other books. Ladies and gentlemen, friends beyond the binary, this is Nathan J. Robinson.
Very nice introduction. Yeah, and of course, a little bit of depressing news out of the UK, but as you say, I mean, one of the really important things is to bear in mind, and one of the things I try and do in the book is to bear in mind the socialist tradition and history and the people who have fought for things before us and the obstacles that they faced and the number of times that they lost and what happened to them when they lost, which is that they often faced, more crushing punishments than we certainly do. And it's a long fight, and the NHS itself came at the end of a fight. It was a fight that took decades, right? The National Health Service, which is the pride of Britain, which is now under threat, was introduced by a socialist government it started in 1948, and it was introduced. By the time it was introduced, 90% of people in Britain had cohered around the position that there needed to be a national health service. So by the time there was the political fight with the doctors, there had been decades and decades of work to convince people to raise their expectations and to tell them in a way that was persuasive that they deserved to have health care that was free at the point of use and available to all. But to have that in Britain was quite surprising because it is a class stratified society. It's a society with an aristocracy. It's a place where that fight is difficult. We think of Britain now, we associate it very strongly with the National Health Service, but it wasn't always obvious that Britain would be the type of country that had something like that. And so it took the work of thousands of people in the Socialist Medical Association and people in the Labour Party to build that over time. And what we're doing happens over time as well. So, and you know, it's funny, the expectations are always adjusted. So, for example, like, you know, Bernie Sanders started out when he started his campaign in 2015, you know, a couple percentage points of the vote, and he builds up to nearly take the nomination. And then after that, the news is asking, you know, why aren't Bernie's candidates winning their elections? Why are only 1/3 of Bernie's endorsed candidates winning their elections? Well, you know, a few minutes ago, socialist was a verboten word in American politics. You couldn't say it. It was considered political suicide. And now we have multiple openly socialist members of Congress. We have dozens of socialist elected officials at every level around the country. We have people on city councils. We have people on the library board. We have people in state legislatures. And really, really incredible people who are now in office, but they are a small minority, and more people lose than win. So, this book that I've written, Why You Should Be a Socialist, a lot of you may be socialists already if you come to this and if you read current affairs, but I actually, you know, I didn't call it Why You Are a Socialist currently and have been. I called it Why You Should Be a Socialist, because my original working title was Socialism for People Who Are Extremely Skeptical of It. And the reason it was that was because I think a lot about how we expand our politics, how we build a movement, and the distinction that Jane McAlevey makes from the labor movement, which is the difference between mobilizing and organizing the people you already have on your side to go out and go to the protest, and organizing by finding the people who disagree with you the most, the people at your workplace who are most anti-union, and then figuring out whether any of them can be brought on board. And in current affairs, if any of you read our magazine, I have tried to put together something that I think, you know, I know probably most of our readership is leftist, but I try and think about, well, what kind of political writing can we do that really reaches and touches people who are apolitical, that doesn't assume that you have to have a certain background or know all the things in order to read it. And it's sort of the same thing you do in Health Justice Now, where you know that's a book that can be picked up and read by I could give it to anyone that didn't know anything about single payer or about healthcare, and they could understand what we're talking about. And I wanted to do the same thing with Why You Should Be a Socialist. I wanted to think about, well, you know, people who do believe the arguments against socialism, and how do I respond? And it helped me sort of try and figure out, well, what is it that I actually believe? How do I use this term? It's a term that's tossed around. How would I define it? And I've been interviewing DSA members for a research project in the last few months, and I sort of always ask them, you know, what do you mean by socialism and what does it mean to you? And the answers actually vary quite a lot. It's not that everyone gives the answer like worker ownership of the means of production, that's socialism. There are some people who say socialism is worker ownership of the means of production, that's what it is. But it's clearly broader than that. It covers more than that, because there are so many people who are socialists who believe in so much more than that. And I tried to get sort of to the root of what are the people who use this term, who apply it to themselves, what do they have in common? The history of socialism is in many ways a history of an argument about socialism. It's a history of an argument about what that term means, because all through the history of the movement, you've had socialists pointing to other socialists and going, "You're not really a socialist, right? You know, you're a reformist, or you're a state socialist and a Stalinist, and so you don't really believe in socialism." So I tried to go, well, what is it that at their core these people have in common? And I found Terry Eagleton has a wonderful quote, and I'm not going to get it exactly right, but the gist of it is, he says, a socialist is a person who's been unable to get over their outrage that most human beings who have ever lived have lived lives of wretched, fruitless, unremitting toil. And what's interesting about that is that that's not a political program. right? That's just, he starts with outrage. He starts with a feeling and kind of almost an emotion. And that is kind of where I think that a lot of it starts. The people who are socialists are people who look at the world and feel very discontented in a way that other people don't. And that certain features of the world upset them, and certain questions that are given simple answers, they're not satisfied with the answers to. And socialists also have this very strong ethic of solidarity, and I think the ethic of solidarity is really core to socialism, runs through the tradition. And you think of the famous Eugene Debs quote, which is, while there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I am not free. Now, we hear quotes like that so many times that they kind of lose their meaning, but it's a very, very radical sentiment, because if you say, while there is a soul in prison, I am not free, it means none of us can be free until there's complete prison abolition, right? That's what that calls for. And I think socialists are people who see their freedom as bound up with the freedom of others. Bernie Sanders had that incredible speech here in New York City where he talked about, you need to be willing to fight for immigrants even if you are not an immigrant yourself. You need to be willing to fight for people with student debt even if you don't have student debt. And that really, there's a very strong echo of Debs in there, because it is that expression of solidarity with people who don't necessarily share your problems. And so there is a sort of emotional core to it. There's a book called The Romance of American Communism that is very good at getting at that Verso is about to reissue, that is very good at getting at the emotional core of left beliefs. Of course, it's not just that. It's not just a feeling of outrage. And I do think that the traditional definition of worker ownership is actually very important to it, and one of the things that distinguishes it from liberalism, because socialism has always been, at its core, concerned with power. Who holds it, who wields it, and who owns and who controls things. And so, this is why the socialist criticism of capitalism at its core is not even, people try and defend capitalism always by pointing to markets, by pointing to exchange and saying, well, you're against exchange. I mean, there is a socialist critique of markets that I think is very strong, but the biggest socialist problem with capitalism, markets preceded capitalism, the biggest socialist problem with capitalism is the existence of an owning class and a working class. And that has always been the core of the critique, is the critique of the class system. And that really isn't so much present, and that's one of the things, the big question that a lot of people have is, well, what's the difference between socialism and social democracy? Because people like Bernie Sanders are pushing a lot of social democratic programs. Why isn't Elizabeth Warren a socialist? Well, one reason is, if you ask Elizabeth Warren, as Amy Goodman did, do you believe that billionaires should exist? She goes, well, of course. What's wrong with billionaires? And the socialist answer to that is that money is power. And because money is power, concentrated money is concentrated power, just as giving one person 1 million votes in a system of government and one person 1 vote would be deeply undemocratic. One of the core things that socialists have always done is they have really tried to understand how power works, who makes people do what, and the means by which they make them do it. This is why socialists try and open up the workplace and look inside. So when socialists talk about political philosophy, they're not just talking about the government, they're also talking about Elizabeth Anderson has this great book, Private Government, that is about workplaces as private governments. And if we thought of these places that we spend a lot of our days as governments, what kind of governments would they be? And she says, well, they'd clearly be dictatorships. And so socialists have always tried to, and always been critical of those who support, quote, social justice, but then in their private lives exercise, happen to be rich landlords or happen to be bosses who bully and exploit their employees. And that comes out of the socialist ethic of solidarity, that ethic of solidarity, that looking at the people who are worst off in society and feeling like until it's better for the people who are worst off, even if things are getting better on the aggregate, we can't really feel free. So this is why criticisms of socialism like that are made by people like, for example, Steven Pinker, who point at like the aggregate statistics, and they go, well, look at all the technology, look at all the, the growth. And you go, well, socialists, understand that capitalism causes growth. That's, that's core to Marx. But one of the things, it's a kind of a misunderstanding of where we're coming from, which is, and it's funny that socialism is always called collectivist, because what we do is actually we break down the social collective into classes and into individuals, and we say, but what are all these people's lives actually like? What is life like for the worst off people in this aggregate? Because you can be going up on the aggregate, but because of inequality, some people are actually going way, way down. And that's the case with life expectancy in the United States these days, where life expectancy as a whole is still going up a bit, but it's going up because the very rich are getting much, much longer lives, and the very poor are getting slightly less longer lives. So that's the kind of thing that we look at and feel deeply disturbed by. And socialism isn't about this, well, things have gotten better. Well, first off, it's very, very debatable whether things have gotten better, because you have to exclude the sort of giant climate crisis and the existence of nuclear weapons that could destroy all of humanity. But even if you accept to the sort of economic statistics, one of the core things about socialism is that it measures the progress of a society by the gap between what is and what could be. And it looks at what is, and then it imagines what we could all do together if we used our resources well. And the reason socialists are so outraged is because the size of that gap has certainly been growing. And we know that the size of that gap has been growing because that's what you get when you look at what are the people's lives like who are worst off, and what are the people's lives like who are best off. And just to tell you what that gap is, if you open the pages of the Wall Street Journal on a Friday, you get their real estate section, which is called Mansion. It's actually called Mansion. And they had a feature, it's the things that the super rich are buying, the houses they're buying, and it says like the new, 100 million is the new 10 million. What used to, it used to be that if you had a $10 million house, that made you super rich, but now you have to have a $100 million house. A few weeks ago, they had, the front page story was, how to move your 10,000 square foot house when the sea levels rise. And they showed a big house on a trailer beam, how you can take it apart and move it to escape the ravages of climate change. And then, of course, we've all seen the lives of people on the bottom. I live in New Orleans, and in the French Quarter of New Orleans, you have the wonderful old mansions that people come to see, and you also have people who are homeless sleeping literally in the doorways of those mansions. And I mean, the other day I was biking home from current affairs offices downtown, and we get used to these things a lot of the time because we see them over and over, and I've sort of gotten used to it. But I had a kind of a breakdown, like burst into tears because I hadn't seen it. It was the day before, it was garbage day, right? And so they had all the garbage bags out on the streets, and people were also sleeping in bags, and I realized that I couldn't tell whether some of the bags were people or whether they were trash. And you see people reduced to the status, no difference between what people have. You have people in bags and trash in bags, and that just disturbed me so much. And it's a very simple thing, right? I mean, and it's not a political analysis, but it is this real deep core, this feeling like this cannot be right. There has to be something better possible. The gap between what we could do and what we are doing is outrageous. And we can list many, many examples of areas in which this is true, right? And you've written so well on the size of that gap in healthcare, and what we could have versus what we do have. And I think one of the things that I like about what you do is, really convincing people that, and this is the socialist slogan, a better world is possible. It's not just that these are matters of injustice. It is also that the injustice exists precisely because it is so completely unnecessary. And socialists have always historically, and I have lots of examples in here, been the ones who point this out with the fury that it deserves. And they have always been told the same excuses that are given now. They have always been told, well, we need this thing to be true. If conservative arguments are the same in every generation, which is if you try to tamper with this, everything will fall apart. Our entire system depends on this injustice persisting. You're going to destroy everything. And you do have to be pragmatic, and I think many socialists throughout history have in fact been pragmatic, and the socialists who are pragmatic are often ignored because they try to develop myths around socialists destroy everything they touch. So they want you to look at Venezuela, but they don't want you to look at like the success of socialized institutions. They don't want you to look at the Bolivian economy. They draw your attention away from all the really great socialists, all the people like Helen Keller and Albert Einstein, and they just say the word Venezuela over and over and over again. I have responses to these arguments in the book, but I think it's so important for socialists are the ones that won't content themselves with easy answers to questions, and they are willing to say things that are simple and true and say them over and over again. Now, there is a response to the sort of socialist ethic that I talk about in here that is, well, everyone believes that. Everyone, Hubert Humphrey has a quote which is, concern for the unfortunate is not socialism. And I was just on Ezra Klein's podcast. Of course, the first thing he says, we all care about injustice. And everyone says that, but it's just so not true, right? Because if you cared about it, you'd be talking about it, right? If you cared about it, you would focus on it. And that's, I go back and forth of whether Bernie Sanders is a socialist. Some people say. I think one thing that makes him really strongly like the socialists is that he is the sort of person who refuses to content himself and draws attention constantly to things that are outrageous and doesn't stop, as Terry Eagleton, doesn't stop being outraged about them. And the last thing I'd say before we start our conversation is that socialists, the people who call themselves socialists today, the people who are running under the DSA banner, these are the people who have, and I think this is very difficult to argue against, who have the only solutions to a number of different social problems. And you can even figure that out from reading liberal media outlets, right? So you take climate change. The Democrats haven't had a serious climate change plan at all until the Green New Deal came along and is now being pushed so hard by people on the left. They had nothing. I mean, even Vox said that. Vox was grateful for the Green New Deal getting pushed so hard because at last there was something on climate change, because they understand the nature of the problem. On healthcare, right? All of these plans that are pushed by the centrist candidates will leave people uninsured and will result in people's deaths. I don't think that's right, right?
It's it's inarguable.
Yeah, it's inarguable that every one of those plans, all those things pushed by people like Pete Buttigieg and Joe Biden, they cause people to die needlessly. So, Medicare for All, which by the way, as you know, is not at all a radical proposal. The reason Medicare for All is not a radical proposal, you can realize it in a second, is that we have fire departments. Right? The fire department is way more radical than Medicare for All. The equivalent of Medicare for All, if we ran firefighting like we run medicine, is like if we had a bunch of private firefighters and everyone had to buy private fire insurance for their own private firefighter. And Medicare for All would be the proposal, well, why don't we have a government-run fire insurance program to pay the private firefighters? So,
right.
That's
still
not
got
right.
little pods of private firefighters all over the place.
Yeah.
So right now, some will take some plans, will take others.
We want single-payer firefighting. And that's why what's cool about Health Justice Now is that the subtitle is single payer and what comes next. And the truth is that one of the things about socialists is that it's true, we're often never satisfied. And it's because we always think in terms of that gap. We always think in terms of, and I defend utopias in this. We always think about, the real outer limits of the possible. What could humanity do together if we really, really took seriously our capacities as a species? And socialists have always had this wonderful faith in human potential. And that faith in human potential is what leads to the anger at the squandering of that potential. So that's all I'll say to start with.
My friend's Nathan Robinson. certainly agree on the healthcare front and also every other front. So
Okay.
I'm a pretty
We're
easy
done.
audience.
We're done here.
Well,
persuaded you.
I've got a couple of pre-written questions which I want to go through.
Yeah,
we
let's
just
do
stick
that.
to them.
Let's do that.
First off, very simple one. Title of the book. You've laid out in this book a lot of reasons for being a socialist. Kind of the underlying worldview, the articulation of class structure, the love and anger, to quote Kate Bush, that goes into looking at the world around us and solidarity for people who are suffering, the cruelty of the world around us. You've laid out passionate arguments for socialism and rebuttals to common arguments against it. But suppose you have a friendly acquaintance, a cable guy, a friend of a friend, a bartender in an empty bar, and you've got 5 minutes.
Yeah.
What do you tell them about socialism, and why should they join up?
You know, the first thing you do, right, is you have to find out about them. You find out who they are. I mean, this is what organizers do. Like, before you proselytize, you try and understand the person you're talking to. And Bernie does this very well. And because when Bernie talks to Trump voters, for example, he finds out about their lives. And usually there's something in their lives that you can grab, because most people, unless it's very hard for me to convince, I can't convince Jeff Bezos to be a socialist. I can't convince someone in whose interest it is absolutely not for socialism to exist to be a socialist. But my colleague Vanessa, who was just told me that she met someone who was an ardent capitalist, very, very viciously capitalist. But then he mentioned that his dad was his teeth were falling out because because Medicare didn't cover dental. Ardent capitalist, and then of course, when you get down to it, when you ask people about their lives, you find most of the time, if you ask people about their work situation, you ask about their healthcare situation, you ask about their financial situation, you find out that there is one of the things that socialists are the only ones that have a program for. There is something like that in their lives. And you go, well, Medicare for All covers dental. So that's one of the reasons. So already, why should you be a socialist? Because then your dad will have teeth. Why should you be a socialist? Because I've seen people are worried about climate change because it's the only way that your children will have a future. And why should you be a socialist? Because your job sucks, and we believe in workplace democracy, and we believe that you should be able to vote for your boss or not have a boss at all, or we believe that people should get to own the things they produce. So because socialism is responding to people's real world lived experiences, it's usually pretty easy to find what those experiences are, but it does involve doing a lot of listening and then sort of applying the philosophy and coming up with things that feel like real solutions, which fortunately we have tons of really, really smart socialists these days coming up with things that are solutions. They're not full socialism, but they get us to a more socialized and more compassionate society.
I've seen a lot of that in healthcare stuff.
Yeah.
I spoke for a while in rural Arkansas, which doesn't sound like a friendly territory, but it totally was. Granted, there's a bit of selection bias. Folk come into a healthcare town hall want to talk about healthcare, and that's what I like talking about. But in rural Arkansas, the big issue was hospital closures, right?
Yeah.
In big hospitals, hospital corporations, or private equity firms, and it's getting harder to tell the difference between the two, buy up rural hospitals and either close them down or use them to charge large hospitals. Like, they close them down so you have to go to the larger hospital and pay larger hospital rates, which is a really rotten scenario if you live in a poor or out of the way or rural county, because all of a sudden you can't go to the doctor unless you want to drive 40 minutes, an hour and a half to get the care that you need. And so talking about kind of the structures by which these things happen, who benefits, because somebody does benefit, there's always profit involved. Yeah. These choices aren't made in a benign vacuum. These things are intentionally designed and crafted to extract money, even though it happens at the unfortunate expense of others. And you can talk about that kind of thing in rural Arkansas. I met a canvasser in East Troy, New York. East Troy is, I think, just east of the capital of Albany, or maybe it's up near Schenectady. And I talked to a canvasser who went canvassing for the New York State Healthcare Act in a trailer park. And he and his canvassing buddy are knocking on the doors, knock, knock, knock. And a guy opens up. The guy has an SS tattoo on his neck. Shit. That's not a good sign. The canvasser was a black guy, so that's like double jeopardy. But the canvasser, who has just fucking incredible poise, goes through with the canvas and says, "Hey, I'm with DSA. We're talking about the New York Healthcare Act. Is what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. What's your healthcare situation?
Yeah.
What are you afraid of? How is your healthcare? How's the healthcare of your family? how are things going? And the guy says, well, I got a bad lung, and I can't afford to take care of it, and I got a little daughter, here's my little daughter, and I know that I'm gonna die and leave her behind, and you know, either like I leave her in debt or I leave her altogether, and I can't figure out what to do. And so the canvasser talks to the guy, he's like very empathetic, and gets the guy to send a petition. It's amazing. The goal, I mean, obviously the answer is not to canvass neo-Nazis. That's not the target demographic. But it's incredible what gaps can be bridged if you offer somebody a material explanation of the things which afflict them.
And even people who are middle class, of course, many of them stay in jobs they don't like because they need to keep health insurance, right? And Medicare for all is the only way that they're going to be able to do that. And that's also why it's so friggin' disingenuous when people like Pete Buttigieg try to portray Medicare for all as you losing your insurance, because it's actually the only way that you'll always get to keep your insurance. And in fact, socialists are the only ones who are envisioning the kind of healthcare system where you, and this is crucial to the socialist vision, and this is one of the things is we always want to decommodify areas of life that shouldn't be commodified. We can have a debate over whether markets are acceptable in certain spheres, but, and there is that debate among socialists, but point of healthcare is, as with firefighting, when you think about healthcare, you shouldn't also be thinking about money. The decision to call an ambulance shouldn't involve thinking about how much money you have. This is also why free college is so important and free public high school is so important, because money just shouldn't factor into the decision of whether you're going to college. You go to college because you'd like to learn something. That should be the choice. You know, what we want to do is free people from the burden of having to constantly think about their finances. You know, this is why means testing isn't acceptable. This is one of the reasons, I mean, and oftentimes people who are liberals come back and, you know, with this typical thing about, well, you want to subsidize things for billionaires' children. But actually, if you say like, oh, well, every person under $100,000 gets the thing, you have to institute a test for whether you have under $100,000, which means someone has to fill out a form, which means someone has to prove their income. And you know, that means that they're going to be thinking about money, even if it ends up ultimately being free. Money is what's on their mind. And we want for these core things, when you go to the public park, you shouldn't be having to think, you know, I forward the admission fee in the public park. The library, the idea behind the library, and you know, a library is not a socialist economy, but a library is a socialized institution in that you can go to it for free, you can read as many books as you like, and it very much differs from, for example, the academic research world where everything is behind a paywall and every article is $40, and that makes research very difficult. And that's a shame, because when you do research, all you should be thinking about is, what do I want to know today? And that really, it stifles innovation to have people having to think about money when all they really should be thinking about is the problem that they're trying to solve. And you know, this is the vision for healthcare, is money's not part of it because it's taken care of by taxes, and when you go to the doctor, that's not on your mind.
So you mentioned our boy PDB, Pete Buttigieg.
Oh God, yeah.
This book has, I think it's one of the things I really like about Nathan's work, both here and in current affairs, is that he's got this constant undercurrent of really deep empathy. He's got the love and the anger, but there's just as much love as there is anger. And I think that empathy is really important. And so the conclusions you draw from that empathy, that we should all be socialists, seem obvious, at least obvious to me.
Yeah.
But why don't more folks subscribe to them? Why is Pete Buttigieg, who's ostensibly a smart guy, probably a CIA spook, why isn't this smart guy of our generation subscribing to these ideas?
Well, because he doesn't give a shit about any human being other than himself, and that's just self-evident. I mean, I don't think that should be a controversial proposition. I think if you just read his memoir, I mean, I wrote a long, some of you might have read my 10,000 word review of Pete Buttigieg's memoir. Now, I did not start off with bad opinions about Pete Buttigieg. Pete Buttigieg gave me those bad opinions over the course of his 250-page book, because I picked it up with an open mind. And as I started reading it, I started hating him. And the reason I started hating him was because it was clear that he was a person who had nothing on his mind except his own advancement, right? So Pete Buttigieg is the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, which is a city with serious racial and economic inequality. Now he's on the campaign trail talking about how much he cares about the inequality in South Bend. in his memoir, he doesn't even mention it, right? He mentions going to Harvard and seeing how wonderful Harvard Square was without mentioning that, like, Harvard is one of the core institutions that reproduces inequality, and Harvard Square is full of homeless people, and the Harvard dining hall workers are constantly having to fight for a living wage. These are things he just didn't notice because he's not thinking about that. He went to McKinsey because McKinsey's at the next stop on the path to a great career and to climb the ladder, not thinking about maybe who are the victims of McKinsey's policies. You know, McKinsey works for Mohammed bin Salman, McKinsey works for ICE, McKinsey works for opioid manufacturers. People die because of what McKinsey tells companies to optimize. It wasn't even on his mind, right? He was asked about McKinsey, but when he started the campaign, and he said, you know, well, why do people criticize McKinsey? They don't criticize lawyers when they have bad clients, which, you know, they should. But he's, you know, I think people demonstrate that they're self-interested. You know, I know the wonderful definition of feminism, that it's the radical idea that women are people, right? The reason that's great is because that is radically different from the society we live in, right? It is actually a radical thing when you actually look at what it would mean to take that proposition seriously. Everyone affirms it. Everyone says, well, of course I believe that. But you go, well, do you really? Do you really? Have you examined what it would actually mean? And socialism almost could be, there could be a parallel in socialism, which is like, socialism is the radical proposition that other people's lives matter. And so I believe other people's lives matter. How dare you say that I don't believe other people's lives matter? And you go, well, the whole reason that there is a Black Lives Matter movement is because, you know, there is a giant wealth gap, and there are colossal inequalities in every area of life. Are you fighting those inequalities every day? You're not, because you don't really think other people's lives are very interesting. You can just go about your life. That's the fundamental premise of libertarian free market economics, is you just pursue your self-interest, and you pursue your self-interest, and then that'll probably serve the public good somehow. But it doesn't. Other people's lives matter. Other people get exploited in that kind of a system. US foreign policy has long been based on not thinking that non-US people's lives matter, and as a result, many of them die. So it is, in fact, it requires a radically different world if you take seriously the proposition that other people's lives matter, which Pete Buttigieg does not.
Damn. But how do you really feel? I have two more questions, and then we'll open it up.
Okay.
We're gonna run, I think, till 8:15, so just a little bit.
Sounds good.
Have a good time. First off, here's a fun one. Which is a more dangerous threat to socialism? Conservatism or liberalism?
Yeah, that's hard, but liberalism is a strong contender, right? Because, I mean, I do think, because socialists have a class analysis, right? Because we think that, like, the thing that kind of matters most tends to be people's position in the hierarchy, we are not really surprised when people who call themselves liberals turn out to hate the left more than they hate the right? A lot of them, you know, despise Bernie Sanders, and you can imagine that there would be a lot of people who, if Bernie Sanders became the Democratic nominee in 2020, would go for a third-party Bloomberg candidacy over supporting Sanders. It is, in fact, part of why Britain is in such crisis right now, because so many people have chosen to support the Liberal Democrats over supporting Labour, right? So people, and it's funny because these are also the people who you hear nothing but you kind of vote for the lesser evil when it's like, why you shouldn't vote for Jill Stein. But then when it's like, why you need to vote for Bernie Sanders, because obviously you don't want Donald Trump, I suspect you might find we would have a very difficult fight to get some of the elite members of the Democratic Party. We're kind of almost lucky that it's Donald Trump who's the candidate, because they actually hate Donald Trump. If it were Mitt Romney versus Bernie Sanders, I think Barack Obama might support Mitt Romney, because, I mean, Obama said there's a report that he'd step in to stop Bernie Sanders getting the Democratic nomination.
Yeah, it'd be a sweet reconciliation. Those motherfuckers love that shit.
So, you know, I mean, Pete Buttigieg and Mitt Romney are very close to being the same person. And they are, so conservatives versus liberals, the threat is not conservative, the threat is that type of person. The threat is that person's the class. And so, Yeah, I mean, but obviously, like, I don't mean to diminish the fact that, like, conservatives these days are borderline, like, neo-fascist, right? Conservatives they wouldn't object, like, if Trump did establish things that, like, weren't just concentration camps in that they concentrated people, but were pretty close to, like, what comes to mind with the concentration. But, I mean, I don't think there's anything that they really object to as long as it happened to poor people and brown people. I mean, there are Silicon Valley guys who suggest putting homeless people in, like, rural encampments. And I'm sure that's discussed quite openly there. And I'm sure many of them vote Democratic because Wall Street's Democratic, Silicon Valley's Democratic, you know, and people like, I mean, I've written recently about Nancy Pelosi, for example, right? Nancy Pelosi calls herself a liberal and a progressive, and then mocks the Green New Deal. She says the Green New Dream or whatever. Well, excuse me, but the Green New Deal is the only serious climate plan on the table. If you mock that, I mean, you are mocking the future of the lives of the global underclass, right? You're denying them their future existence. And so, like, that's an equal threat. And in fact, it might be a bigger threat because Pelosi is going to stand in the way of people in the Democratic Party trying to put forward things like Medicare for All. She says she wants to stop Medicare for All. So I don't know who's the bigger threat, but liberalism in that variety. I mean, I think there's a sort of respectable kind of progressive liberalism that we could work with, and we have to try and work with people when we can. But there is a lot of elite liberalism that does pose a significant threat.
Cool. Little topic change. I have one piece of good news.
Yeah.
Not really a question. But,
Okay.
you mentioned in the book the election of Franklin Bynum in Houston. He was an open socialist running for a judgeship in Houston. County judges are elected on 4-year terms. And he ran as an open socialist in Houston, which is a purple city, but it's Texas, so times are tough. I'm from Houston, so I can say that.
Houston used to be called the capital of capital punishment because of how many times the death penalty was prosecuted. The prosecutors asked for the death penalty there. So it used to be really bad on criminal justice.
With Runnels yesterday, right? We're still doing it. It's fucking abysmal. Anyway, Franklin ran along with 17 black women who swept. Mm-hmm. And Franklin is a guy that I look up to a lot, and he fought for and passed the repeal of cash bail in Harris County. Yeah. Which is the first and largest county, I think largest county in the US, and certainly the first largest county in Texas, which has stopped using cash bail as a model of getting people in jail for a long period of time. And now elsewhere in Texas, Texas, that progressive stronghold, cash bail is being attacked in Dallas and in San Antonio and in Fort Worth and in Austin and in El Paso. Like it was cool seeing a person who explicitly identified as a socialist leading a fight that is now sweeping across the entire state to stop one of the smaller hammers of being used to punish and dominate people.
It's true. I mean, it's really important. The reason I mentioned Houston's status is because he's changing that city's criminal justice policies, and he's not the only one who's managing to do that. Socialists take the lead here. There was another judge that I met at the DSA convention who's a housing judge in Pennsylvania who has basically stopped evictions in his court. Mick Pappas. Yeah. And the thing is, this is another example, everyone says they care about injustice, but the socialists are the ones who are willing to imagine and then implement radical solutions. And what you often see is that people who are non-socialists then, I want to say co-opt, but adopt those socialist proposals. I mean, that is exactly what happened with the Bernie 2016 platform, which is now the every Democrat 2020 wants to pretend they have platform. And that's what happened with the socialists in the early 1900s in the United States, where the sort of things they were pushing were things that socialists were talking about. We need an 8-hour workday, we need weekends. Those things became the consensus. And that's why you have things that socialists push that are then accepted as not radical. The NHS was pushed by a socialist government, or at least a government that calls itself a socialist government, and now and now the conservatives have to pretend that they care about the NHS, even though it obviously violates free market principles, and they would sell it the moment they could. Because what socialists do so successfully is that they move our conception of what's possible, and they get stuff rolling, and they break through when people are pretending to care, and they go, well, if you actually care, maybe we should just do it. Maybe we should just end. If we all agree that cash bail is bad, well, let's run, let's get elected, and let's do it. This is also why a lot of people in places like Texas can come to respect socialists, because we are not hypocrites. We actually do the thing that we say we believe in.
And in Texas, there isn't Democratic parties. There's nobody holding us down from the center.
Yeah.
Last question. Lastly, you say you're not an optimist, and you don't care for the term hope. But it feels like every day brings with it a new disaster, human rights violation, or looming menace. To some extent, this is a consequence of news saturation, and certainly things have seemed awful for hundreds and hundreds of years. But if it's not hope, and it's not optimism, what keeps you going?
The first thing, can I just ask if I could get some water from someone, because I have run out and I can feel myself starting to cough. I want to be able to answer people's questions. So I talk about, the reason I say I'm not an optimist is because optimism is kind of a prediction of the future. The optimist is about what will happen or what won't happen. Pessimism says things will go badly. Optimism says things will go well. I think the future is very, very uncertain, because if there's one thing that is certain about the future, is that we're really, really bad at knowing what can. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. We're really bad at knowing what can and can't happen. So many people predicted that we wouldn't have Donald Trump as the president of the United States. Turned out not to be true. Turned out that more things were possible than seemed possible. But that goes in the other direction too, which is that everything that is good, that is radical, seemed impossible at one point before it began to seem inevitable, and it actually came to pass. But what the people who pushed those things, and the people who have accomplished victories before us, all shared was not optimism, but a sense of determination. And I talk a lot about how the substitute for, I think Barack Obama ruined the word hope, because it made it seem kind of meaningless, so I don't really like it. But determination I like, because determination says I don't just hope for a different kind of future. I know what the future could be like, because I've looked at that gap between the possible and the actual, and I am damn determined to make sure it happens, and to band with other people and to bring it about. And determination helps you avoid pessimism and resignation, because you can be determined even in absurd circumstances. You can say, we don't look at the percentage chance of having to or whether we're going to succeed. We set percentages aside. We don't care about whether we're likely to succeed or fail, because we're determined. And as long as you have that can really help keep your spirits up. And I think that's a good way. That's the way that I think about what I do and fight them.
Thank you very much.
All right.
My friends, once again. Let's do 20 minutes of Q&A. If you got Q's, Nathan will A them.
If I can't A them, I will hand them over to you to A them.
I will A any question as well. I don't care what it is. I'm a wild card tonight. I'm a real gunslinger. If you have an A, raise your hand, or Q, raise your hand, and I will call on you, and I'll try to keep an order in mind. You in the
Hey!
Hello.
Hi there.
Hi. So, in a recent online current affairs thing,
Yeah.
you did like 5 different reviews of
Oh, yes.
like self-written reviews.
Yes.
Yeah. There's one review that you write by a hard left Marxist of the book,
Yes.
and you go on after like writing these
Yes.
joke reviews to address the content of the reviews,
Yeah.
say what you felt was fair and unfair.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you expected hard left Marxists to say about this book that you thought was valid was that you don't talk a lot about international socialism,
Yes.
or the extent to which social democracy,
Yes.
or even productive functioning socialism
Yes.
in countries in the global north
Yeah.
is predicated on extractive economies
Yes.
in the global south.
Yes.
Can you just say a little bit about like your thinking on that, and in terms of like the utopian thinking that you
Yeah.
like to engage in, what is the long game of
Right.
the relationship of socialism in the global north to global finance?
Let me repeat the question for everybody. The question was, let me repeat part of the question, everybody, because that was a long question. So Nathan wrote some reviews of his own, some criticisms of his own book from different perspectives.
I think I'm the first person to have written 5 reviews of their own book in the voices of different people. So if you go on current affairs, I have a Marxist review, I have a libertarian, I have a liberal, I have a manatee. I have a sea creature who says, I'm not interested in this book because it's about humans, and I am a manatee. And I have one by me, which is sort of me assessing my own flaws and responding to those kind of arguments.
I mean, you're certainly not the first person to review your own book multiple times. That's what Amazon's predicated upon the first week of the book's launch. The question was, one of the assessments of the book that Nathan wrote about his own book was that of the international Marxist, which is that this book does not go into the relationship between global capital, the socialist North, and the global South. So the question asked, Nathan, can you talk to us about, like, in your ideal state, in your utopia, how does the socialist global North relate to the both international, like, finance machine and the global South, which is exploited all the time?
Why do you ask me such a difficult question? I mean, yeah, so this is something that doesn't really come up much in the book. I had a section on international socialist movements, and ultimately cut by the publisher because we were running over in terms of our allotted page count, which tells you something, I think, because it's considered a lesser part of the book, but it's actually quite important. You know, the reason I say you know, frustrated Christians is difficult because you're asking me to imagine a functional global economy. And that is something that I think is very difficult, and one of the things that I try to do in this book is comment on the things that I think that I understand well, and try not to go too deeply into things that there are other people who understand far better than me. And I think, you know, I try to show some humility in thinking, you know, well, where can I get people started here? Where can I take non-socialists and introduce them to the socialist political tradition? And that was something that felt like another book that needed writing. And it's really unfortunate. The reason I think that the criticism I wrote of myself was correct was because it is something that without which the analysis becomes a little strange, because it's an analysis of socialism in one country, because I write a lot about the contemporary United States, but of course the socialist program is ultimately workers of the world unite. It is about how ownership and how control function on a global level. Now, I can't answer the ultimate question of how do you build an equitable world. How do you have something where rich countries don't extract and exploit wealth from poor countries? I will say, though, that in reflecting on my own book and seeing that sort of element that wasn't there, being frustrated and criticizing myself for it, I realized what my next kind of project is, and where I want a lot of our future current affairs writing to go. And I'm hoping that this is the sort of beginning of something where I hope that other people take the weaknesses in my book and we start having a conversation as socialists about where the things that I don't know, and building the project together. Very unsatisfactory answer, but I did my best. Thank you.
Nathan, you take the phrase, "you're your own worst critic," extremely literally.
Oh yeah, I try to be as mean as possible in those reviews so that nobody could be meaner.
That's good. I can try that. I saw a cue back there. What's up?
Yeah, well, you talked a lot in this presentation about solidarity, I think about very material concerns in terms of righting wrongs in the world.
Yes.
And one thing that I think has also been a focus of current affairs that I wanted you to maybe go a little more into is the ways that socialism might change the livability of our spaces in our lives. So you've railed against what you see as neoliberal architecture, bad food, bad culture, the gentrification of New Orleans, and the loss of this sort of unique culture that comes from people democratically deciding how to build a space. So I'm curious what you think the relationship between socialism and just, you know, how nice our lives are is, avoiding also the accusation of champagne socialism, whether or not people here are drinking champagne.
See, this question I like. This is the sort of question I can ask. Is that Henry?
Yeah.
Henry! Can I say who you are?
Yeah.
Henry is one of the Gravel boys.
Oh shit!
Who is one of the Mike Gravel 2020 presidential campaign. He and David Ox, is it just the two of you? Yeah.
We are friends.
Oh, but you were the two from the Gravel campaign, and they did a fantastic job
Podcast a few months ago.
launching what was one of the most amusing, but also your campaign drew a lot of attention. That it had a serious undercurrent, which was drawing attention to things that even Bernie Sanders shied away from at certain points, and I think it was really valuable. And even though you never got Mike into the debates, that was useful. So thank you so much.
The Gravel gang question was,
Yes.
how does socialism affect livability of spaces, architecture, geography, etc.?
Now, and you said, and yet avoid the accusation of champagne socialism. I don't think we should avoid the accusation of champagne socialism. Socialism requires champagne. I believe the way I approach this is that I think we need to really strongly reject the idea that socialism is about, I think, I don't know if it's Churchill or someone, the equal sharing of miseries, right? Socialism is about the good life for all. And that means good things. That means encouraging people to raise their expectations. The bread and roses, the worker must have bread, but you must have roses too. There's a reason that the symbol of the DSA is not the bread, it's the rose, right? Because the rose is so important. We're not just trying to give people full bellies in this sort of dreary, utilitarian, basic needs fulfilled world. We're trying to give them things that are beautiful. We're trying to fulfill human potential. I've written an article about this, what I consider the socialism of Mardi Gras, because I'm from New Orleans, and Mardi Gras is certainly not very capitalistic, because you're banned from advertising on the floats. But there's something beautiful about Mardi Gras because it's a very economically inefficient holiday, because people spend an entire year making a costume they'll wear once, and it's this beautiful kind of moment of coming together to have something that is way more than bare subsistence. It is, it is something that great that we generate together. And so I think those things are tremendously important. Now, that's not to say that because of the way that inequality works, that nobody would ever see a reduction in their standard of living. I mean, I look at the Wall Street Journal mansion section, I go, well, that's not generalizable. We're not all going to have 10,000 square foot homes. But I do think, I won't get into my architectural criticism because it's the most controversial thing I ever write about, because architects are more prickly than anyone else. But I mean, I think the central point that I make there is that we should look at our spaces and say, is this space beautiful? Is it good? Does it make me feel? And when I say beautiful, I mean when I look at it, do I feel good from looking at it? I was just on the Amtrak coming up here, and the Amtrak's internal color scheme is gray on gray on gray. And the Amtrak was an incredibly depressing thing to be on. And I want public transit where when I step onto the train, I feel good. I feel like I don't feel like that I'm in a train that has just been designed to get me from place to place as a state form of transit. I want to feel like I'm on a train that loves its passengers. When I step into the station, I don't want to step into Penn Station. I want to step into something that gives me a sense of awe, that takes my breath away. And I think what we aspire to is to have commons, to have public places that really are not just like the state providing something gray and bland that is the thing that poor people have, but to give the workers roses too, to have places that are socialized and are also the best possible thing. So not just basic healthcare, but great healthcare, the best possible. This is why when Bernie says Medicare for all is going to include dental, it's going to include vision, it's not going to be, like a cheap pair of glasses. It's going to be good glasses. It has to be good.
And from that goodness is begetted your goodness, right? Like healthcare is housing, is food, is shelter.
Right.
You know the nice thing about Amtrak?
Yeah, no.
When
I don't know the nice thing about it.
I spend a lot of time either living in Boston or dating folks who live in Boston and commuting. And occasionally there's somebody at Amtrak who works the speaker and really likes their job and tells jokes, makes you feel good. And
Yes.
it changes the entire train from gray to rainbow. It just takes one little nice person. Everyone
Yes.
deserves to have the comfort to be that nice person and make the train nice.
Yes.
So I think it's nice. That's not important. You get to ask a question.
Yeah, so Tim talked about the example of canvassing the neo-Nazi as like an example of how you can convince people to support socialism or socialist ideas once you show them it's in their own self-interest. But then you also, Nathan, talked about how important it is to socialism that like it's about like caring about other people.
Yes.
So how do you kind of bridge that gap with people that we need to win over to win these things? Because it doesn't seem like self-interest is going to take us as far as it
Right.
needs to.
Self-interest doesn't get you everywhere, because there are some people who are not really encouraging that we would do things that are necessary. I mean, you could say, well, you know, a society is in the interests of all, but there are some places where individual self-interest, at least as it is conceived by the person, does kind of conflict. I mean, I was thinking recently of the example of a worker-owned fossil fuel company, where like, it might be great for, we might have socialized, we might have had, you know, worker ownership of this company, but it is not in the interest of humanity as a whole, even as it is in the interest of that narrow band of people. And, you know, you have this in the labor movement too, where what's in the interest of one union might not be in the interest of the other. What is nice about you know, the way I think Bernie frames it is that he says, well, you know, a lot of the things we work on are not going to be in your individual self-interest. What I am asking you to, and I think this is really important, is, you know, you ultimately do have to get beyond showing that each policy will be good for you personally, because there are going to be things where you don't have any debt. You're not an immigrant, and we need to persuade you to join it. Now, of course, if you add up all of the members of the global underclass, you know, socialism pretty much has something for everybody. But the point is that we have to present a coherent vision of this, a coherent and powerful vision of a world that is good for as many. Again, if you find the one person who socialism has nothing to offer to, you find someone like Bezos, you find you know, someone who's a real tyrannical boss, you can't persuade them to have different values necessarily. You've got to figure out who you can work with, who you can talk to, and do a mixture of, and it's a difficult question, it's something that's worked out in practice, a mixture of appeals to common values and appeals to people's personal problems and the way we're actually going to address them. And hopefully, if you do that, we will have enough people. We don't have to get everybody. We have to get enough people. The 2016 election was winnable. It wasn't won, but it only would have taken a few more people. So all we have to build to have a movement is enough.
Let's take one more question.
Okay.
You've had your hand up for a while.
Try to sneak two in. One frivolous, inspired by your podcast this week, and
Okay.
another serious. Aliens, agents of international intergalactic communism, or CIA agents? What do you
What?
think? And more serious. You know, there's a whole discussion on your podcast this week about aliens, so I think
Yes,
you should say something about it.
Did we speculate on?
No, I'm
Can you
asking you to
clarify
answer
the
the
question
key
for me.
question.
Clarify the question. I will answer this question.
This is right. So, like, okay, to get into it, there's a whole, maybe not well known, but tradition within the Marxist movement that says if there are spacefaring alien creatures,
Yes.
they inevitably have to arrive at a level of communism that would allow for them to not have eradicated themselves.
Okay.
That's one view.
Yes.
Another view is that it's simply
Yeah.
our state, the CIA,
Yeah.
etc., cavorting with creatures from beyond to be able to help with our
Okay.
oppression, etc.
Okay.
It's a frivolous question. The more
Okay.
serious
No,
one, very-
it's not a frivolous question.
the more serious question, though, is I think one of the issues that we as socialists get blasted with, and Bernie in particular, often in bad faith, but there's something real there, is not having anything specific for oppressed people. That the only thing we have to offer is the class struggle. What does that say for black communities or for women, etc.? And I'm curious the way that you thread that needle. I think there's a number of very good answers to why a fight for a better society that raises all of our horizons is key for everybody who's oppressed. But curious how you work that through and what you think about the relationship between the two aspects.
Well, Bernie's actually gotten much better at this campaign on it, because I think the 2020 Bernie campaign has realized that was kind of a weakness. That the line used to be, well, you know, Medicare for all will be really good for black communities because it disproportionately benefits and whatever. And the critique that was made was, yeah, but there are also specific injustices that affect particular groups, And you can talk about how universal programs are very help address these specific injustices, but there are things. The black-white wealth gap is a black-white wealth gap. Discrimination is an issue that is racial in nature, right? And I think, I actually like talking in the book about why I think the concept of intersectionality is actually quite useful, which is that there are sort of different dimensions of oppression, and black women experience oppression differently to white women who experience, and a white homeless man has problems that a wealthy black man does not necessarily have, and that as long as we understand these dimensions, we can target our policies specifically. And I think I think the campaign this time has done a very successful job of talking about those specific kinds of things. And what I love about contemporary socialists is that they actually do a very, very good job of this generally. The DSA, they talk about racial justice, they talk about disability, they talk about Native people, and they talk about their issues as their issues and not just part of the class struggle. I actually think that this new socialism that is developing isn't this kind of class reductionist socialism, and in fact that's quite rare. What you have is a socialism that really does understand the world in all its complexity, which is why very few of the socialists that I ask the question, what does socialism mean to you, reply ownership of the means of production, because it is more than that to them. It includes that, but goes beyond it. Aliens, so my only position on aliens was that there definitely are aliens. That's what I said on the podcast, because I think it's such an arrogant thing to presume that we are all that there is. It's a very big universe. That would be a very arrogant thing to presume that we are the most developed form of life in the universe. That's hard for me to believe. Now, the question of whether aliens have reached Star Trek post-scarcity communism, or whether aliens are the equivalent of Elon Musk colonizing and privatizing all of space, I don't know. And I'm afraid. And I think our job as socialists is to make sure that when we go to space, we're going to be the post-scarcity Star Trek communists. And that's all I can say about aliens. Thanks very much.
Nathan Robinson. You can buy his book here at the bookstore. If you've already bought Nathan's book, consider buying a second copy. You already have 2 copies. A third one could be on the way.
It's a great holiday gift for reactionary relatives. My intention was to make it amusing to give it to them. So if you find the person who disagrees with socialism the most, and leave a copy of this, and I think the reaction will be one you enjoy. So I'm going to go down and sign books. So I hope to meet lots of you at the signing table.
Thank you very much.